Think about this rhetorical question: if you've ever been treated unfairly or unjustly. You know, I love, my mother was very wise in many ways, and I remember when, you know, if you give kids like a candy bar and you say, hey, split it, you know, they're going to like, you know, one kid's going to get it and split it and take the biggest end, right? You know, and you'd be like, man, I got the short end of the candy bar, that's not fair. But my mom was so smart and she wanted things to be fair, not to be unjust, and so she said, all right, I'm going to give the candy bar to you or your sister, and you get to take the knife and you get to cut it, but the other person gets to choose first which half, you know, that they get. So you know that thing was divided right down the middle. You know, there was justice in that situation. But you may have been in those situations where your siblings have shorted you in some way, or you face some kind of injustice in the world. It might be in the workplace, it might be at school, it might be at your home. Like you're doing your level best. You're like, man, I am doing what is right. I am doing what is good. My integrity is there. And that no matter how good and how much you've done, that person or whoever in whatever situation has treated you unjustly and unfairly. I remember one time, and I talked about speeding last week, so just trust me, I don't speed a whole lot, but we talked about last week, we talked about being subject or submitting to government and how that worked as a follower of Jesus in a world that is not kind to Christianity. But I remember one time I was driving from my apartment to seminary one morning, and I was in a 55 mile per hour zone, and I'm humming along, and I had my cruise control set on 60, because you get 5, right? I mean, everybody gets 5. It's not set. I hope that's not a sin. So I got my cruise control set on 60, you know, and I'm going along, listening probably, you know, because I'm, you know, pretty godly, you know, whatever. Probably listening to Christian music and praying. It's about a 2-hour drive, and just enjoying it and do it all the time. And all of a sudden, there's Mr. Blue, you know. And I don't want to be mean to you cops, because I love our police, and they do amazing work. But I'm being pulled over by this highway patrolman, and I'm like, man, what's going on? I look down, I'm driving 60, you know, what's the big deal? He pulls me over and he says, you know, do you know how fast you were driving? I said, well, I had to, you know, I don't know, we're on the speed limit. Yeah, I couldn't be honest, you know, say I was driving 60. I don't want to admit to that. But he's like, well, according to my radar, you were driving 75. I'm like, what? I mean, I was flabbergasted. Like, you got to be kidding me. I had to set on, the cruise controls on. There's no way. I mean, the car I was driving was so old. If I was driving 75 miles an hour, it would have been shaking, you know, and things have been falling off and stuff like that. But he gave me a ticket, and I was just so like, this is not fair. This is so unjust to me. Like, it's my word against his. I mean, I was so mad about being treated unjustly and unfairly. I knew where the highway patrol station was. I drove there. And I went and I talked to his commanding officer, and I said, this is not right. He's not telling, I don't know what's going on. There's something wrong. And there was nothing I could do. And the guy was like, whatever, you know, stupid kid, you know. So he sends me on my way. I mean, I go in and get my speedometer checked, you know. I take it and get it, they put it on a little thing, you know. And what had happened was, they said when I was driving 60, I was actually driving 57. That my speedometer was actually showing that I was driving 60. I was actually driving slower than that. And I'm like, does this guy have dyslexia? You know, like he thinks I'm driving, you know, he's reading his radar and it says 57, because that's how fast I was driving, according to me. All that to say is I was treated unjustly and unfairly. And that's not even a big deal. I mean, whatever, I went and, you know, got a plea for judgment and no points, you know, no fine, whatever, you know, pay a little court cost or whatever. But you might can think of, you know, there's a lot more serious instances in our lives where we're really trying to do what's right, we're trying to do good, and we get treated unjustly, we get treated unfairly. And what's going to happen this morning as we look into this text is that God's going to show us that He has a purpose and that He has a plan for when these things happen in our lives. He's going to do it in the context of kind of in our work environment and where we work. So if you have your Bible, you can have it, the 1 Peter there, chapter 2, and it's also on your outline. I want to read the scripture that we're going to talk about today, and then we're going to go through it. And I've italicized, underlined, and bold printed some words that we're going to focus on as we go through it. So here we go, 1 Peter 2, 18 through 20. It says, servants, be subject to your master with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if, when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. What does God want to teach us out of this? How are we going to see that we are never more like Jesus and when we are suffering for doing good and that this is a grace opportunity? The first thing I want you to see is to focus on that word servants. The very first word in the text is servants, be subject to your masters. If you want to take a note, I want you to write over the word servants, just write the word slaves. because when our Bible translators, I don't know why they chose to do it, this is actually the word for slave. He's not talking about a servant, like household servant, a guy that gets to go home whenever they want to. He's talking about somebody that is, in fact, a slave. The Greek word is slave. Maybe it's nicer, it's a little softer to say, oh, well, servants, be subject to your master. No, he's talking about slaves. But a quick word on slavery, because slavery comes with so much emotion behind it, particularly in our culture and how America was founded and all the slavery and the Civil War and all that's going on in the news. A couple things about this. One is that the slavery in the first century Rome, it was very different and it was very the same as what we might have heard of in our culture. But here's the deal, is that for first century Rome, slavery was not based on race. It wasn't like one race superior to the other. Usually the slaves were captives of war, or people who would sell themselves into slavery because they had become so destitute is that they needed employment, they needed food, and so like, no, I'll sell myself into slavery so that I can provide for myself and for my family. And so they willingly went into it, but the reality was is they could work their way out of it. That there was usually some sort of like plan, like in 7 years you're going to get out, you'll work your way out, or you can save up enough money and you can then buy your freedom, and then you'll be back on your feet and you'll be okay. But in the ways that it was different, it was also the same, is that it really was an evil institution in so many ways, and that the slaves didn't have rights, and they weren't treated fairly, and they weren't treated right, and that's a way that it was similar to the way we have it in America. But the deal is that Peter in the Bible, unfortunately, I say that unfortunately, the Bible never actually addresses like the issue of slavery. I wish it really would. I don't want to like God say, slavery is wrong, because it is. And we know that. And the Bible taught there's slavery in the Old Testament times, but it's totally different than what we understand and know in the beginning of American times. But Peter is not, and God is not here addressing the issue of slavery. What he is addressing, though, is that when these early Christians, after Jesus was crucified, resurrected, appeared to everybody, and people started believing him and the church started, some of those people who believed in him were also slaves. And so Peter's giving a message here saying, hey, if you're a slave, I want you to know here's how you act as one in this context. Here's when you're getting treated unjustly and unfairly, you're living in this occupation, so to speak. Here's how I want you to live. But notice what the Bible, this is the verse that's there on your outline, 1 Corinthians 7:21. The Apostle Paul, he talks about slavery in a similar way. But he says, were you a slave when you were called? That is, when you came to know who Jesus was and you put your faith in him. He says, don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. And so Paul's saying, if you were a Christian, where you were a slave and you became a Christian, you don't have to get out. You can stay there and you can live and you can honor God in that scenario. But if you do get a chance, it's better to be free. You'll have the opportunity to go and do more for Christ. Take your freedom. So the Bible is certainly not saying it's okay slavery's okay. But the Bible it's not addressing that issue specifically here. But moving on from that. So it says, servants, it says, be subject to your masters with all respect. I want to focus on that word with all respect right now. The situation there in that word in the Greek, if you want to write something over that one as well, it actually means in the words in all fear. So it could read, servants, be subject to your masters in all fear. Respect sounds a little bit nicer, but the question for me, Rose, was is it out of respect for my master, or is it respect or fear for God? And what I think is happening in some other translations translated in this way, it's not talking about out of respect or fear for your master. It's out of respect or fear from God. The previous verse that we covered last week, verse 17, it says, fear God. Honor all people. Honor the emperor, but it says, fear God. For us, all of us, it doesn't matter who's in charge and authority that you're being subjected to, that you're submitting to. Whether it's your teacher or your parent or your employer or the government, it's not about who they are. It's not about fearing them or respecting them. There's a level of that there should be there, but it starts with God. I'm not sure if I put this verse on your outline, but 1 Peter 2:3 or 2:13 from last week, it says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. And so our fear, our respect, it starts with God. The reason, God, that I'm going to be subjective, or I'm going to subject myself to a master, and that word says subject, it means to submit. I'm going to put myself under them. It's a military term, and if you've been in the military, there's levels of authority. And you choose to go into the military and you go, you know what, I'm going to be under this person because that's where my rank is. And so we're saying, you know what, I'm going to put myself under this person, but it's not because of who they are. And it's not necessarily because of their rank. As a Christian, it's because of who God is. And he says, I'm going to honor everybody the way that I should. So it's out of respect for God that it starts and ends with him. And some people go, well, why should I fear God? You know, like, because fear, I mean, that's not a word that we really talk about a lot. You know, like respect's a little easier. And it's interesting because the Bible says, you know, Jesus calls God the Father. And I love, he did that famous prayer, the Lord's Prayer. He says, Our Father, who art in heaven. You know, I don't want to fear my dad. I don't fear my dad. But I do have a reverence towards my dad. I do have a respect towards him. But back in 1 Peter, when we started, verse 17, for chapter 1, it says, if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct, or in other words, live your lives with fear throughout your time of exile. That there's not a conflict with God. He is a loving Father, and he cares about us as his children. And he wants us to honor and respect and fear him. So servants or slaves, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. I want to talk about the context here of what's going on. When we're being called to be subjective to masters, when a slave, and really, and I don't know if I made this clear or not, it's talking specifically about slaves, but I think the application this is to all Christians. They were all called to be subject to those in authority over us and to do good. And so when you go to school, your teacher is an authority. Your principal is an authority. When you drive on the road, you know, whether you're, like I used the example last week, I'm 46, you know, but a 22-year-old cop is an authority in my life, and I need to honor them when they pull me over or stop me for any reason. The government's a place of authority. Mom and dad are a place of authority in the house. The teachers, all of those are human institutions that we are under authority to. And to how we live, but what context is it happening? He's saying we want to be subject, and so talking from the slave situation, it says be subject to your master, submit to your master. But what's happening? Notice what's happening as they submit to them. He says not only to the good and the gentle, would it be nice to have a good and gentle master, but also to the unjust, to even the ones that aren't kind. It says, for this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it you endure? But if you do good and suffer for it and you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. The context of this is you've got these people who have become Christians, and they were slaves, and they're under a master, and they're under his authority. And Peter and God is saying, you know what? You need to stay. You need to subject yourself. You need to submit. You need to be under their authority. I want you to honor them so that I get honor out of this, even when they are being unkind and unjust and unfair. And isn't that an odd thing, though? Because you would think, like, if I'm a servant or a slave, and I'm under somebody, and I'm saying, you know what, I'm a Christian. You know, I'm going to do the very best that I can. I'm going to work really hard for this man. I'm going to work really hard for this woman. I'm not going to steal. I'm not going to cut corners. I'm going to be subject to them. Whatever they say, I'm going to do. When they say how to jump, I'm going to say how high. And you're being subject to them. Why would they do any harm to you? Why would you suffer harm for doing good? Because you're being subject to them. And there's a couple of answers when I thought about this. I'm like, well, what's going on here? Well, one is, if you're out in the world and you're being treated unfairly, you know this as well as I do. There are just people in the world who are just like that, right? You're going to get that teacher who you just cannot do anything right by. You're going to get that boss that no matter what you do for them, they're not going to treat you in the right way. You're going to have sometimes your parents, you know, you're going to think, hey, they're just not listening to me. They're not being fair. They're being unjust. And that's just their nature. That's just their personality. You're going to have these conflicts. But in this situation, it could be that you know, hey, if you're a slave or servant, you've got a master over you, sometimes they're just going to be a jerk, and you want to honor God in the way that you respond to that. That's really important. But I think what's happening here is that there's a conflict, because what Peter says is that you are suffering for doing good. He says, but when you do good and suffer for it, you endure. What's happening is that you're subject to your master, but sometimes your subjection or submission is going to come into conflict with what is good. Because as a believer, and this is a theme throughout the book of 1 Peter, we looked at it last week over and over again, he uses the phrase, do good. When you do good, when you do good, when you do good. That's a distinctive of us as believers in Jesus, is that we're trying to do our very best all the time to honor those who are in authority above us. And when we're trying to subject ourselves, though, to somebody who's not a believer in Jesus, who's like, in this case, a slave owner, and we're their slave, we're their servant, sometimes our good is going to conflict with what they think is right and good. Isn't that the way it goes? Look at the verse on your outline. I think this is powerful from Isaiah 5:20. It says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." The truth of the matter is, people in the world are sometimes going to call good evil, and they're going to call evil good. That we're not going to think the same. We're going counter to culture. And that what the principle here is that our doing good is going to trump our submission. That Peter and God would say, you know what, we need to be submissive to those in authority over us, but our main priority is to do what honors God. We fear him first. We keep him. That's why I underlined in your text there the words mindful of God and in the sight of God. And then it all starts with him. We do this out of respect and fear of God, and we do what's right. And sometimes that's going to conflict with what the person in authority over us thinks. And so then as an act, even though you're doing good, you're doing what's right, you are going to suffer for it. Think about these men and women in the first century who were slaves or servants. You know, they've become followers of Jesus, and they're under one of the most severe Christian persecutions that's ever happened. That, you know, hey, you're a slave. B, you're under severe persecution. This is not going well. And then on top of that, your master is unjust and evil and unkind. You know, that's not good. But Peter says, I want you to see that there's a purpose and there's a plan for this. And this is where it gets really, really good for me. Notice the next word on your outline there that I put is the word highlighted is the word gracious thing. The gracious thing. He says, for this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows. This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. What does that mean? And that word is such an interesting thing here. The word in Greek is the word charis. Does anybody know what that word means? What that translates to? Charis. That's the Greek word for grace. So if you read it back, go back to verse 19. It says, "For this is charis. This is grace. When mindful of God, one endures suffering when suffering unjustly." Grace is what we call God's unmerited favor. That's what the gospel is. That's the good news, that each and every one of us is a sinner that's sinned against God. But out of God's grace, out of his goodness, he gave us a favor. He did something for us that we couldn't earn, and that we would never be able to earn, and that we wouldn't deserve, and that Christ died for our sins and rose again. And he says, if we put our faith and trust in him and believe in him, he will forgive us and set us on a new life and show us how to live our lives in a way that's in a walk with him that honors him. That is God's grace. And so it's so interesting to me, like so many of the different translations, if you have a different translation in the Bible, yours might say, for this is commendable before God, or this finds favor with God. But I love this translation that it at least says this. It says, for this is a gracious thing. Is that there's something gracious about your living. There's something gracious about your living. Look at the passage that's under there. This is from Jesus, Luke chapter 6, because the same word is used. And I want you to see the connection between these two. This is Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount. And see if this doesn't sound like what Peter's saying. He says, if you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? That word benefit is the word charis. It's the word grace. So you can read it. If you love those who love you, what grace is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good, that's one of Peter's themes throughout, to those who do good to you, what benefit, and that's the word grace, is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. And here's the distinctive of Christianity and what God does in our life. He says, but love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Jesus says, what benefit is it to you? What grace is? He's saying what we do when we do good. And it's the same situation. This sounds just like Peter, and I think this is because Peter spent so much time with Jesus, and he's trying to communicate to those early Christians. And in this situation, those early slaves who would become Christians, you know what? Your call is to do good, but sometimes you're going to be treated unfairly and unjustly. But I want you to honor God in the midst of all that. When they revile you, don't revile back. When they curse you, don't curse back. Return it with a blessing so that you can point them to Jesus. And that's what the grace is all about. I think that's what it's all about. Is that the scripture here in 1 Peter, it tells us, it says, for what credit is it to you? That there's a credit for us, and we get a benefit when we honor God with our lives, when we go into our workplace and we say, you know what, I'm going to honor the person in authority over me, but I'm going to do it out of fear of God, and I'm going to make sure that God's name isn't profaned because of the way I live. That we get a benefit. God, and even if we suffer unjustly, even if we don't get that promotion, even if there's no raise or whatever it is, at work, at home, at school, we get treated unfairly, I'm going to honor God in the midst of that. God says, you know what, I'm watching. And there's going to be a credit to you. There's going to be a benefit. There's going to be a grace that comes to you. I'm going to reward you for your behavior. And that's great. I want to be rewarded. But I think there's another level of reward, and that's what this word grace is all about here, is that it's not just for me, it's for others. The point is that people can see the grace of God in my life and long for it. The very, under so what? It's the very next section following this one. It says, to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. When we are called to suffer, we are never more like Jesus than when we suffer. It's because Jesus suffered for me. He died for my sins to extend grace to me so that I could have my sins forgiven and washed away and given a new life and the promise of eternity. And God says, I did that for you. Christ did that to you as an example so that you could follow in his footsteps. So that when you go out into the world and you're treated in a wrong way, God says, I don't want you. When they say all kinds of bad things about you, when they lie about you, when they beat you, whatever it is, whatever unfair way that happens in your life, when you respond with grace towards them, that you don't respond showing evil for evil, reviling for reviling, or curse for curse, but you respond in blessing, that person sees the grace of God in your life. Christ died for you and me because we were far from him. The very last verse in that section under so what, in 1 Peter 2, it's actually 1 Peter 2:25, it says, for you were straying like sheep, but now have returned to the shepherd and overseers of your soul. Each one of us, just like that unjust master, just like that evil master, they are straying and they're far from God, and they're a not yet follower of Jesus. But we say it that way. I don't want to say that person is an unbeliever or a heathen or a pagan. I want to call them a not yet follower of Jesus, because I was a not yet follower of Jesus at one time. And I chose to do some of those things that dishonored God. And I might have treated people unjustly and unfairly. And I wasn't kind. And when people hurt me, I would hurt them back. When people would curse me, I would curse them back. But because he says, you were all like that. He says, for you were strayed like sheep. All of us were just like them at one time. But God's grace has come into our lives. And when we respond in that way with grace towards other people, they're going to be pointed to him. I wonder, if I were to visit you at your work, or if I wonder if I were to visit you at your school, or I wonder if I was to visit with you in your home and I don't know your family, and you were to say, hey, this is my pastor. Pastor Mike has popped in at my work. Didn't know he was coming. Pastor Mike showed up on my campus. Hey, teacher, that's my pastor. Would they go, wow, you must have a really bad pastor? Because I've seen the way you behave. Or when they go, wow, that makes sense now, because I've seen the way that you live, and I've seen how you've been treated unjustly. I've seen how you've responded to the people at your work, or the people at your school, or the people at your home, and how you take that abuse and you just let them heap it on you, and you don't respond in kind, but you respond in love, and goodness and kindness, and you just shine. You go, wow, that must be a great pastor and a great God because of the work that he's done in your life. I'm going to mess up this story, but I heard, like this past week, I was driving into work, and I'm a pastor, so I listen to sermons on the radio. And they introduced this message. It's a similar message in another book of the Bible. They introduced it with a story about Alexander the Great. One day, there was a soldier who had done some wrong. He got in trouble for it or whatever, but somehow he was getting out of it. And Alexander somehow was in the situation and was talking to the soldier, and he said, soldier, you've done all this or whatever. What's your name? What's your name, son? So my name is like you. It's Alexander. And the story goes that Alexander looked at him and said, son, you either change your ways or change your name. Because he didn't want his name to be dishonored. When we live our lives in mind of God, with God in mind and inside of God, you say, God, I don't want to dishonor your name. I don't care how they treat me. I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to do good. I'm going to make your name great through my life. Let's pray. Lord God, thank you so much for those early Christians. God, they suffered immensely under Nero and the Romans. Lord, they had it pretty hard. And God, most of our unjust and unfair sufferings that we have here are probably nothing compared to what they went through. But God, we may come under some pretty harsh things. And God, we just want to honor you with our lives. We want to make your name great. God, so that, Lord, when your Spirit visits somebody and says, and knocks on the door of their hearts, and they hear the good news of Christ and that he died for them and rose again, that they'll want to receive him in. And they'll think about us and go, wow, look at the difference that Christ has made in that life. Look at how they live their lives. God, I need your forgiveness, and I need something like that in my life. But God, we just pray that, Lord, that our lives would be reflective of you. And that, God, we would see people come to know Christ and the gospel and the grace that you extend to us. In Jesus' name, amen. As we close out our service this morning, each week, we pass there's some buckets that are going to get passed along the outside aisle, and you can just pass them towards the middle, and those people passing the buckets will also come back around, and they'll collect them as you just hold them in the middle, and that's an opportunity for you to grab that connection card. If you have, Matt Tuck talked about that on the announcement videos, to say, hey, this is what God's doing in my life. You can pray for me. I need to ask Jesus into my heart. I need to know about baptism. I need to know about what it means to become a member of this church. And if you're new with us, if you're a newcomer, we just love to be able to follow up with you. And I hope you got your newcomer gift as you came in the door. We have coffee mugs that we give out to people just to say thanks for coming this morning. But return your connection cards. If you have any offering this morning, put that in, and let's stand and sing in response to God.
You're the one
throw out this morning the last verse on your outline there. We covered this last week, 1 Peter 2:12. Keep your conduct, that is, your life. You're doing good. Among the Gentiles, honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Our lives are to be a grace, so that people can see the grace that's come into our lives, and that will point them to Jesus. So, friendship, I send you out to go live lives full of God's grace. You're sent.
Yeah. Just my card.